When we hear slave trade, we often think of the United States of America. But did you know that many other countries played major roles in slave trade? Here are top 10 slave trading country and estimated number of slaves taken, methods of transportation, how the slaves were captured, and where they are living currently. Let's get started. Number 1. Portugal. Portuguese explorers began capturing and trading African slaves in the early 15th century, initiated by Prince Henry the Navigator. The first African slaves arrived in Portugal and its colonies in the 1440s. Approximately 4.5 million Africans were taken to Portuguese territories. Slaves were transported in cramped and unsanitary conditions aboard Portuguese slave ships. Slaves were primarily sourced from West Africa, particularly regions such as present-day Angola and Guinea-Bissau. They were often captured through raids or sold by local African rulers. Many descendants of these slaves live in Portugal, Brazil, and other former Portuguese colonies. Portugal was among the first European countries to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, officially ending it in 1836. Number 2. Spain. Spanish explorers initiated the transatlantic slave trade in the late 15th century, driven by the demand for labor in the New World. The first African slaves arrived in Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and South America in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Around 1.86 million Africans were taken to Spanish territories. Spanish slave ships transported slaves under brutal conditions, often resulting in high mortality rates. Africans from regions such as present-day Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria were captured and enslaved by Spanish traders. Slaves were often captured through wars and raids or sold by African leaders. Descendants of these slaves live in various Spanish-speaking countries in the Caribbean and Latin America. Spain abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1811, though slavery itself was not fully abolished until 1886. Number 3. England, later United Kingdom. English involvement in the slave trade began in the mid-16th century with the formation of various trading companies like the Royal African Company. The first African slaves arrived in English colonies in the Americas in the early 17th century. Around 3.1 million Africans were transported to British colonies. British slave ships transported slaves in overcrowded and deplorable conditions, known as the Middle Passage. Slaves were sourced primarily from West Africa, particularly regions such as present-day Ghana and Nigeria. They were captured in raids or sold by African intermediaries. Many descendants live in the United States, the Caribbean, and the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire by 1838. Before we continue, please smash the like button and subscribe to our channel. Number 4. France. French involvement in the transatlantic slave trade began in the early 16th century, spurred by economic interests in the Caribbean. The first African slaves arrived in French colonies in the Caribbean and Americas in the 16th century. Approximately 1.3 million Africans were taken to French territories. French slave ships transported slaves in horrendous conditions, with high mortality rates during the Middle Passage. Africans from regions such as present-day Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Benin were captured and enslaved by French traders, often through wars or local trading networks. Descendants of these slaves live in former French colonies, including Haiti, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and parts of mainland France. France abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1815, and slavery itself was abolished in French colonies by 1848. Number 5. Netherlands. Dutch involvement in the slave trade began in the early 17th century through the Dutch West India Company. The first African slaves arrived in Dutch colonies in the Americas in the early 17th century. Around 550,000 Africans were transported to Dutch territories. Dutch slave ships transported slaves under horrific conditions, resulting in significant loss of life. Africans from regions such as present-day Ghana, Angola, and Madagascar were enslaved by Dutch traders, often purchased from local rulers. Many descendants live in Suriname, the Dutch Caribbean, and the Netherlands. The Netherlands officially abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1814, and slavery itself was abolished in Dutch colonies by 1863. Number 6. Brazil. Portuguese settlers in Brazil began importing African slaves in the early 16th century to work on sugar plantations. The first African slaves arrived in Brazil in the early 16th century, soon after the Portuguese colonization of the region. Brazil received around 4.9 million Africans, the highest number of any country. Slaves were transported to Brazil on Portuguese slave ships, enduring harsh conditions during the Middle Passage. Most slaves brought to Brazil were from West Africa, particularly regions such as present-day Angola and Congo. They were captured in raids or sold by African rulers. The descendants of these slaves are a significant part of Brazil's population, especially in the northeast and southeast regions. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, finally doing so in 1888. Number 7. Cuba. Spanish settlers in Cuba began importing African slaves in the early 16th century to work on sugar and tobacco plantations. The first African slaves arrived in Cuba in the early 16th century, shortly after the Spanish colonization of the island. About 800,000 Africans were transported to Cuba. Slaves were transported to Cuba on Spanish slave ships, enduring brutal conditions during the Middle Passage. Africans from regions such as present-day Congo, Nigeria, and Benin were enslaved and transported to Cuba. They were captured through raids or sold by local chiefs. Many descendants live in Cuba and the Cuban diaspora, particularly in the United States. Spain abolished slavery in its colonies, including Cuba, in 1886. Number 8. United States. The transatlantic slave trade to British colonies in North America began in the early 17th century. The first African slaves arrived in the British colony of Virginia in 1619. Approximately 388,000 Africans were transported to what is now the United States. Slaves were transported to North America on British and later American slave ships, enduring the horrors of the Middle Passage. Most slaves brought to North America were from West and Central Africa, particularly regions such as present-day Ghana, Nigeria, and Congo. They were captured in conflicts or sold by African traders. Descendants of these slaves primarily live in the United States. The United States abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, and slavery itself was abolished by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, with full abolition following the end of the Civil War in 1865. Number 9. Haiti, Saint-Domingue. French settlers in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, began importing African slaves in the early 17th century to work on sugar plantations. The first African slaves arrived in Saint-Domingue in the early 17th century, following French colonization. Around 800,000 Africans were taken to Saint-Domingue. Slaves were transported to Saint-Domingue on French slave ships, enduring horrific conditions during the Middle Passage. Africans from regions such as present-day Senegal, Guinea, and Benin were enslaved and transported to Saint-Domingue. They were captured in local conflicts or sold by chiefs. The descendants of these slaves are primarily in Haiti. Haiti became the first independent nation in Latin America and the Caribbean in 1804, following a successful slave rebellion. Slavery was abolished during the Haitian Revolution. Number 10. Denmark, including the Danish Virgin Islands. Danish involvement in the transatlantic slave trade began in the early 17th century. The first African slaves arrived in Danish colonies, including the Danish Virgin Islands, in the early 17th century. Around 100,000 Africans were transported to Danish territories. Danish slave ships transported slaves under brutal conditions, resulting in high mortality rates during the Middle Passage. Africans from regions such as present-day Ghana, Nigeria, and Angola were enslaved and transported to Danish colonies. They were often captured in raids or sold by local leaders. Many descendants live in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Denmark. Denmark abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1803, and slavery itself was abolished in Danish colonies by 1848. Thanks for watching. We hope this video helped you understand more about the countries involved in the transatlantic slave trade. If you found this content informative, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great content, and be sure to check out our other videos. See you next time.